So, as it happens, my stories tend to be, as we put it, untold, partly because I started out as a freelancer. And in order to make your way to NPR, of course NPR had Nina, Koki, and Linda. And I don't even have to say their last names. Maybe for some of you students I do. It's Nina Totenberg, Koki Robertson, Linda Wertheimer, but they were known, you know, like Cher by their first names. These were just lovely. And they did deal with the honchos. You know, they were always inside. They were working in Washington. They were working the Hill or the Supreme Court. They were clearly in a fine tradition of first draft of history journalism. But most of the rest of us out in the countryside, which I was at New York, I don't know if you count that as countryside, but I was traveling a lot. And most of the rest of us, especially freelancers, we really had to fend for ourselves. And we had to find our stories. And they had to be different. And we had very few resources. So we were not looking for stories that worked for that evening or that morning or the next morning. For a lot of the time, we were looking for secondary stories. And we were also, if you think telling a story that brings you down to on the ground with people is a good idea, which I think it is. Of course, we had to go out there and get the tape. Nothing could be done really by phone. We actually didn't have a way of doing that. Most of us out there in the field. You also, NPR let you get really close to the story because they basically made you stay the night with the people that you were interviewing. I mean, there was no budget, and I am not kidding you. There was really no budget for hotels back in the 80s. You didn't really stay with the people you were interviewing, but this was a common thing to be asked, do you know somebody in a city, or do you mind staying with somebody that one of us knows in a city that you were going to cover a story? And I'll tell you just one when we hit a moment when I realized, wow, I do this for love. Back in 1988, I had already been host of All Things Considered, so I had some resources. And I wanted to do a story about the 100th anniversary of South Dakota because my family on my mother's side were pioneers. And they had pioneered the place she grew up in, the farm sort of ranch, because it was cattle mostly, in Nebraska, just south of the border with South Dakota, Hay Springs. They lived in Chevron, which some of the family just kind of about due north of here in the Panhandle. Anyway, they were pioneers, and so I was interested in the South Dakota aspect of it, and going back to this and talking, and we had stories all broken up, pioneer women. But my first big mistake was to make sure that they really knew I wanted to do it. So immediately the budget got like half as small, you know. But they did give me an engineer, Suzanne Mesnick, her name was, and she was never been like west of New Jersey, so she was like all excited this was going to be a big trip out, and didn't realize I was holding the purse strings because every dollar I didn't spend was dollar I could theoretically spend for the next story. And this is actually for your students out there. This is my 5 years. I walked 5 miles in the snow story. You know, steadily from day to day, it was a week trip. Got running shorter and shorter of money. At one point, we stayed in my cousin's double wide on the Mission, and you know, it's on the Rosebud Reservation in Mission. He and my uncle owned a general store there, and there we were. But we needed a hotel the night that we took out the flight in Pier. We ended up in Pier for our flight out, and we walked into a hotel. Not as nice, not that nice, but nice, decent, you know. And I looked at I went up to the desk and I said, I turned around and I came back to Suzanne, who by this time was totally crestfallen because the trip was just one, you know, cheese sandwich after another. And my relatives the night before, so, you know, she was like, this wasn't that much fun. And I was reading my story, so I was in heaven, but we ended up at this hotel where it was I shouldn't call it a hotel, motel. It was 2 stories, a big place, and there were rooms. If we walked into Suzanne's room, I was helping her with her equipment. Big room, I mean, really massive big room, because they got a lot of space out there in South Dakota. And I thought, and weird little bathroom with a molded, like something you'd find in a boat, you know, like set kind of in the corner. The bathroom was like a bedroom size. And so I thought it was really odd that the bed was, you know, I thought, designer, they have no sense of design, you know, the bed was like right up against the wall. And Suzanne was freezing because, guess what, you'll all relate to this, the temperature had plunged. And we weren't really dressed for it. I mean, it plunged in a matter of an hour. So we're in there, and she's saying, there aren't enough blankets. I mean, there's just this little blanket and a little coverlet. And, you know, and we should go to the front and get more blankets. I'm like, man, you know, our plane's at 5. We're going to be out of here. It's hours. What did the pioneers do? They have, you know, we've been hearing about women going mad. planes, you know. That was my I interviewed a 103-year-old woman, and she told us about that. You know, like women, I never thought that men went up to, you know, Rapid City to mine for gold and have a pretty good time, and the women stayed behind for the entire winter, you know, with nothing to look, nowhere to go in their sod hut. And so, you know, I was like, what? You know, get with it, Suzanne. And he said, look, I'll show you. Fold the blanket over. Let's just fold the blanket over. So we started yanking, you know, to get it over so we could fold it. Wouldn't yank it, wouldn't yank it. So she was up there and she was like, I'll get it. Then she turns to me, she said, Renee, a blanket is nailed to the wall. It was that level as it turns out, hunters stayed there. And in fact, we were woken up about 2 hours later trying to start their cars with, what do you call hair dryers. Because the cars were, you know, the engines were getting cold. So we didn't get any sleep. And, you know, it wasn't the Oxford, which is where I am now. So I'm in permanent appreciation of anything I get along the lines of elegance in class. So thank you, by the way. That was wonderful.